feel comfortable with?
What I feel comfortable with? Don't take this dude's course. All right, everybody. So I've been asked to lie to you as much as possible to try to get this man some business. This is Scott Moulton. For you guys that haven't had to do drive recovery, but will at some point, you'll see My Hard Drive Died. MyHardDriveDied.com is an excellent place to send your buddies to when they're trying to drive and you're not comfortable working on it. But if you'd like to learn, I took Scott's class, Forensics and Data Recovery. I'm a certified data recovery expert, if you can imagine. It's the first certification I've ever gotten in my life to do with IT. So
I should say something right there.
Yeah, that should say something. This book, we can pass it around. It needs to come back. This is the textbook that we used in the class that I went to.
How much?
How much? An ass load, but it was well worth it. No, I don't know
what is an ass load.
It's a metric or standard SAE.
I charge $3,500, and if you are government or some professional organizations, you get a discount $500.
I went.
How about religious figures?
You're fucked.
We'll talk later.
I took Scott's class. Vanderbilt sent me down for that, and what was it? I was operating on Skydog time, but it was 8 o'clock in the morning, 8:30 in the morning.
The thing I remember the most is like a week after the class, he sends me an email and says, I just got back from the doctor, and he says my brain will stop swelling now, and the bloody nose has stopped running, because I cram in, what you'll see here in this presentation, I actually do like solid for 5 days. Everything from forensics all the way through data recovery, and typically law enforcement or all walks of life are pretty much in there. So
basically, it's like going in and being force-fed from a fire hose from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. What I ended up getting from the class is I would go in the morning, I would meander in, saunter, I would do something just in time to sit down and start class, and Scott would do nothing but fill your head with information. We'd take a lunch, good food provided by him and his wife, and we'd munch, everyone kind of chat, we'd go back in class, and you'd get the same stream of information. When you're there for, 2 hours, and you start cracking hard drives open and changing platters and changing heads and things that I didn't think I'd ever be doing outside of a clean room. Did a lot of that stuff. Then we would go eat dinner in the evening, and then we actually sat outside and drink beer and swap stories and go about midnight every night. So I enjoyed the class a lot. There's actually a couple of pictures of me in here, which I've asked him to remove, but he said he wouldn't. I don't have enough cash on me this weekend. I want to drop the book off on the side if you'll flip through it and everything. I encourage you to, if you ever wanted the desire to work on hard drives and do some data recovery, to chat with Scott. Try to get all the information out of him you can for free, if you can.
I do a lot for free.
There you go. I asked Scott, if you've ever seen any of his presentations, they're very, very well done. They're animated. It takes, a
not
year?
This one.
Well, no. It takes about a year to render all the frames and everything in it. I went to Scott and I said, you've got this cool stuff. I said, I need you to do a talk for PhrakNIC. And he said, what kind of cash are you paying? And I said, look, dude, you got enough out of me.
He's lying.
I know. And I said, Scott, do something different, like something you didn't know about hard drives. So Scott actually went through and prepared this presentation for us. How much am I having to pay for this? I'm just kidding. Scott, thank you very much, sir. Appreciate it.
And believe it or not, he actually disassembled a hard drive in a conference room on an open table. And he's one of the few people who actually got hard drives working. We actually, in this class, we got a lot of people who actually got it working, but there's always a few people who can't reassemble and deal with the hard drive and get them running again. But believe it or not, he's taken a hard drive completely apart, heads and everything, and reassembled it and put it back together, and it worked. So amazing.
And I'm the fourth person to ever score 100 out of 100 on his test.
Okay, so basically I do computer forensics. That's my first and primary job. And when I was doing computer forensics, one of the things that I crossed over into was doing data recovery for cases and casework where it wouldn't be handled properly maybe by someone who was just running a data recovery shop or doing something like that. So I spun it off into a whole nother business. And I've done, if anybody in here seen all my animated presentations? Anybody in here seen those? No? Okay, so there's quite a few that I've actually done, probably 20 or 30, and there's 50 or so free hours of how to actually rebuild a hard drive from the ground up, do head replacements, splatter replacements, build stuff, and it's all free. It's all out there free. So if you don't want to take my class, that's fine too. I don't care. But there's always a lot of people who want some other stuff from that standpoint. So I'm happy to answer any questions or help. I believe give it away. So at least from that standpoint, still going to make a living, but nonetheless, I'll tell you anything I know. So this is kind of a result, this talk is kind of a result of the questions that don't normally get answered in classes or my other presentations, trying to fly through this content. So this is kind of the trivia stuff. This is, hopefully, at least my belief is, there's going to be something in here for everybody, that whether you're using Windows, Linux, Mac, whatever you're using, there's going to be some hardware, there's a few software things, a couple of things that are just, I thought they were cool when I was going through it, and no one really thought there was a lot of material there. So I'm just going to try to hit those type of topics, and feel free to stop me, ask me questions, or whatever else. So this is a big one that I get a lot of, which is, there's a better way to wipe your hard drive. Everybody always comes to me and says, well, how do I destroy the data on my hard drive, and what's the easiest way for me to do this? And DBAN is one of the most common ones. Everybody know what DBAN is? Anybody use DBAN? Right? So there's a couple of tools out there that you basically boot on a boot disk and you wipe your hard drive. And there's a difference between wiping your hard drive while it's running an operating system and just physically wiping the entire disk. So most of the time we want to make sure all the data is gone and it's wiped, and there is no chance anybody's going to get that data back. And so people go, well, I need to do this 35 pass wipe or something like that. So one thing I want to point out is that most people don't know that this even exists. In 2001, there was a big move by the government and the DoD to have a faster, easier way to wipe and have it built in to the ATA standard. So in 2001, they actually started adding to the chip on your motherboard and to the hard drive itself a way for them to communicate and do a wipe of the physical system on the drive. So what I want to make sure that you understand out of this whole thing is that this thing that's called the secure delete, this thing it does need a piece of software to initiate the command. But after it initiates the command, it's not using software to get that done. It's a communication between the ATA controller and the hard drive itself that's going to go through the process of wiping your hard drive. So it's going to go a lot faster than what you would normally expect, and you're not going to see the same results you might see in software. But so I'm going to kind of go through a little bit of what this is. Right now, there is a piece of software out there. I'll give you a link to it in just a minute. But this is just basically the rudimentary thing that it looks like. It's like a boot floppy, a boot CD. You can boot on it, and you're going to send the command to the drive to wipe it. Now, right now, there is kind of like a proof of concept utility that's out there. This all works. It's all done. But there needs to be other implementations. There needs to be people adding code into Linux and to Macs and other ways to actually wipe these drives if you wanted to do it. Because right now, the guy who wrote the proof of concept basically he's done it as a Windows boot floppy, so it's using FreeDOS and stuff like that. But it'll ask you like 27 times, how do you want to erase this disk? Do you want to get rid of it? And basically, this is done by the Center for Magnetic Recording Research Center, and this is, again, funded by the government. It goes through a number of different processes. But the idea was to create a standard that would actually do an erase and becomes a disk standard that everybody's going to support, whether it's SATA, ATA, whatever you've got, ZIF sockets, something along the way. And they're going to try to follow the DoD standard, the 5220. Now, this standard for sanitation, basically, it doesn't specifically say, here's how you do a hard drive or something like that. It has a destruction policy with how to wipe, basically get rid of zeros, fill the content, and actually confirm that it's actually done. So this is to follow that. The link down here to this particular utility is down here at the bottom. And so I'll give these slides out later or do something with it. But I want to make sure that you understand this is part of what's actually in the ATA command set. The difference here is that that's not what actually happens when you plug a hard drive in through a USB controller. When you plug in, if anybody see the talk earlier about key logging and hardware key logging stuff? Okay, so when you plug in a device physically through the USB port, it has what's called the DMI code. It basically sends a command back to the operating system that says, I am a printer, or I am a mass storage device, or something like that. So the DMI code that actually comes back from that says, I'm a mass storage device. Start up the mass storage device driver. So that's a generic driver that does not have all the support that you would normally have in the ATA command set. So what I'm talking about here actually physically has to be connected to the ATA controller in order for that to actually happen. Everybody clear on that? So it's not going to happen if you have a USB plugged into your port and you're trying to erase it. You need to go back to an ATA. So it will work on laptops. So if you're actually running it like internally on the hard drive itself, you could wipe your laptop's hard drive by sending this command. So this is the guy, Gordon Hughes, who basically designed and worked with a team at CMRR to actually develop this content. And he basically says secure erase is a means of erasing the data, blah, blah, blah. The important part to me is this one right here, reallocated blocks. So now this is where we differ from every other piece of software out there in the result. From a standpoint of taking something like dban and booting on dban and running it to wipe your drive, dban is a software-based utility. So it does not have an easy way to say, I've got a bad block on my hard drive. Everybody know what bad blocks are? Everybody good with that so far? Okay, so on your hard drive, physically, if it has a bad block, it adds it to what's called the G list. There's a grown list of bad blocks. There's also a P list, which is the permanent list. But the content that you actually have that was sitting in the sector, the hard drive never erases. If content's written to the block and it says, okay, fine, I got an ECC back, and the ECC says, I've got a bad block, it leaves it there, and it puts a sector, it puts it in the sector, basically a redirection to a different sector, and then goes there and writes that content. So you might have hard drives that are in a stack on your table because they were going bad over time. So you've got a lot of bad blocks that physically exist on the drive that if you took dban and you wiped them and you work for the DoD and you go on eBay and you sell them, that those blocks still have content in them. That is not erased by a software utility or any other wiping utility out there. You've got to have a way to clear the bad block list in order to do that, which only data recovery companies that have the right hardware and the right software to actually do it can do, with the exception of this tool. This tool actually will wipe all the reallocated blocks. It goes track by track, sector by sector through the hardware and says, I don't care what your reallocated block is. I'm not going there. I'm going to erase this sector. So if you guys can't see where this is really important, I mean, you can still recover 512 bytes of data for a lot of blocks on a hard drive is still a lot of data. There's still a lot there that you can actually tell what this person did. And certainly if it's DoD, you're not meeting the criteria that you actually have to do to wipe a drive and get rid of it, which is still, you use a hammer as your only other method pretty much. So this exists. Basically, there was some problems with some of the earlier standards. So drives that are from 2001 to 2004 basically had one standard that was implemented. They needed a higher end standard than that. They needed a way to confirm that the content was actually wiped. So basically, Gordon went in 2004 and talked to the committee, and they came up with a new standard, which is now applied. So now if you have a drive that supports the new standard, when you go through the boot process to wipe the drive, where you actually boot on this disk and you go through the process, there may be two choices now. So if you don't have a drive that supports it, it'll only have one choice. If you have a drive that supports the new standard, it adds the second one. Now this means every drive pretty much since 2005 that has been manufactured has this piece of code added to it. So you have a combination now of what's coming out on motherboards and physically on the motherboard itself talking to the drive, and 2005 will give you a little bit higher end standard for how to actually go back and erase the drive. So we're talking 500 gig, 600 gig drive, 500 to 1 terabyte gig drives. So that was added to the drives. One of the things that I was talking about before from a standpoint of people going back and trying to confirm that content is erased, the other thing that happens a lot is people go, well, is it really gone? Can I go get, I always hear this big thing about some, microscope that can actually read this content. So there is an MFM microscope. I have a friend at the University of Michigan who sent me this picture because they have one of these $1 million systems. This is actually what it looks like on a CD when there's a track. So it looks a lot like an ultrascan or something like that because it's actually using the magnetic frequency to tell you what's physically on the drive, in the platters, and in between tracks. This space is a lot smaller on a hard drive, extremely small by comparison. So when you're trying to do something with an MFM microscope and you're trying to read content, you're trying to read it at the edge of a track. You're trying to say, okay, fine, you erased it and the center is gone, but now there's this residue on the outside edge of a track that says I had a 1 or a 0 or something went by. It's not truly a 1 or a 0, but it is extremely difficult to read from that. It will take like 18 months. There's another process that actually has to happen with regards to cylinders, and I'll get to that in a minute, because you can't just take a snapshot of one side of a disk and read content. you've got to take snapshots of multiple sides. So I'll go through that portion in a minute. But the point is that it doesn't take 35 times to pass across the drive to erase the content so that you can get it back. Yes, sir? He asked me about an 18-month time frame being, based on a certain amount of data on the drive, an estimate of the size of the drive itself. No, it's based on a couple of numbers I've heard about how long it actually takes for them to read the drive and actually go through it. So they're real processes, but they haven't told me what the size of the drive was. So I didn't get feedback from FBI or something on the size of the drive that they read the content back from. So... But again, my point is that it doesn't take 35 passes. And so this is well defined, and this is actually part of what this process actually goes through. So Gordon's point is that it's a lot faster to use this built-in method, that he actually goes back through a process of verifying the data. And so in my lab, I actually did an erase of a 500 gig, 3.5-inch hard drive, and it took 2.5 hours to do an erase and to confirm. So if anybody's done an erase on a 500 gig, a wipe on a 500 gig hard drive from beginning to end, including bad blocks, obviously, you know that it takes a lot longer. I mean, minimum in most cases is going to be 8 to 16 hours, something along those lines. And the other thing that's kind of unique, at least from this standpoint, is his program, his application. On the hard drive, there's a security feature where you can actually enter in a password. And so physically, he makes an entry into the password table so that the drive can't be used again until the password is passed again and it's unlocked. So he locks the drive. So if something happened and somebody pulled power from the drive while it was in a wipe cycle, supposedly it cannot finish that wipe cycle because you cannot go and use it. So you have to resubmit the password and go back through a wipe cycle again. So it's supposed to protect it. The unfortunate problem right now is that the password is published. So we know what the password is. So we can actually go back. If you did not physically have control of that drive and you do not finish the wipe cycle, I can go and apply a password or just wipe the password itself from the SA area on the drive, and I can get the content that's left. So make sure you're actually physically able to finish the passes, because it is able to be recovered if this mechanism does not completely stop that from happening. So I don't know that they're working on a solution for that. I doubt it. But at least from that standpoint, you need to physically be able to be there for the whole thing. So that's my number 10. So now we're going to number 9. So now we start kind of crossing over into a little bit of trivia and some forensic stuff. So we've all pretty much heard from, I just grouped these together, based upon we're dealing with Linux, NTFS, HFS, things like that. So these are all file systems that we have all heard of. Can anybody think of one that might become really popular really quick that you haven't heard of? Anybody know where I'm going with this? Nope. Next. Nope. It's I should have probably put it on the list already, but it's existing. Everybody knows the format and everything. What's that? What did you say? ext4. No, that's still not done. FAT64. Okay, so most people don't even know that it actually exists right now. Here's one of the reasons why you don't know what FAT64 is already. FAT64 is the ability, we've gone from FAT16, FAT32 are typically the most common FAT tables that are available for all operating systems. It's been published. People can use it. There is a new one that's FAT64. And it was originally introduced in Windows Embedded CE in 2006. But basically right now what has happened is in Service Pack 1, when Vista was released, Service Pack 1, they added EX64. So you now actually have the FAT64 on Vista for all 6 people that are using Vista. So right now what happens is you go to format a drive that's bigger than 32 gigs. If it's bigger than 32 gigs, because if it's smaller than 32 gigs, Vista will default and tell you have a choice of FAT, or you can do NTFS, which will be your typical choices. Now you actually have the new one, which has magically appeared on the list, which will be FAT64. The problem is that it's in Service Pack 1. So if, for instance, you format your drive as FAT64, and then you go back and something happened, your system crashed, and you wanted to go back and get it again, and you go pop your disk in, it's not in the disk that you bought. It's in Service Pack 1. So you've already got to get a machine set up, so there's no compatibility from that standpoint going forward. But originally, its focus for FAT64, and this is why it was in the embedded devices, is for solid state. So if you've seen my presentation on solid state before, you'll understand some of the problems dealing with solid state and how it moves the stuff around for wear leveling and what kind of problems that's actually causing, like on current cameras and things like that. So So here's kind of the stuff that's really good from a standpoint of FAT64. FAT64, one of the things that solid state needs is solid state actually has a table on the device that actually says, where's my next free block? It actually wants to do that much faster than what you would see on your current hard drive. So they kind of compensated for that in FAT64. In FAT64, they added the ability to have a free bitmap that actually says, okay, fine, where's my next spot that I'm actually going to deposit some information so I can get there faster. They added support for more than 1,000 files in a directory. These are the kind of things that kill me, though. Support for the ACL. So you have support for security, but then it's not implemented. So they added it to be able to format, but then you don't have any implementation. So if you use it, and let's say, and this really impedes this in the future. So let's say they use FAT64 in Windows 7 or whatever the hell they're calling it this week. So let's say you use it, and it does have support for the ACL. So they add it in. Now you have security. All you got to do is take your drive and go back to a Service Pack 1 Vista and plug it in, and you just bypass all the security because it's not supported. Right? That's all you got to do. So they don't complete something before they release something. So I don't know what the story is there, but the other thing is, too, it does have support for TFAT, which is basically transaction-oriented. You know it is journaling. Basically, everybody else calls it journaling, but Microsoft calls everything transaction-oriented. So there's an ability for, okay, my FAT drive, whatever it was, my solid state actually died. Now I can actually track transactions and back them out. So it's there, so there is some future for it. And then you also have the ability, if you guys don't know this, like if you're using FAT16, the largest file size you can actually have is 2 gigs. If you have FAT32, the largest file size you can have is 4 gigs. So you can't take that 4.3 gig DVD and write it to a FAT16 or a FAT32. So that's a current problem we have because those are the most common to move between operating systems. So if you want to take something from a Linux box and go to a Mac box, if there's no support for it, you have no way of actually having a larger file on the disk rather than breaking it up or something like that. So there is support for it up to 16 exabytes. But again, your problem is we don't know what the support's going to be. If they don't make it like open source or give it away or they patent encumber it, we're not going to be using it on other operating systems. And it does seem like they're going to use the patent system to basically keep it locked up so far. Hopefully they'll release it and let it out so at least we have another option than FAT32 because it's time to move on. All right, so now this one's going to take a little bit more from a standpoint of 2 and 2 and putting 2 and 2 together. It's about partitions. So physically, when you're looking at content that's on your hard drive, and let's talk about just the platters, because the hard drive does not know about your files. It has no clue about your files whatsoever. So we're going to talk about the structure and how it actually deals with speed and what's actually stored there. Now, this picture is actually upside down. Everything in a hard drive is actually counted from the bottom up. So bottom is going to be 0, and you're going to count up. So this is upside down from that standpoint. We have a couple of things that I want to point out here. One of these is that there are slices of information here that's called servo alignment information. Now, what happened is in 1986, we moved away from what's called a stepping motor. We had a stepping motor that moved the head, and it was just like a floppy disk drive. It said, I'm at track 0, I want to go to track 18. And you can move the head 18 steps by moving your stepping motor 18 steps. Well, that's kind of gone now, so we don't have that ability. We moved to what's called a voice coil, and the voice coil works like a speaker does. It moves in very, very small increments. You apply a plus or a minus value to your power, and it actually moves the head down the platter itself. So servo information is information that tells the head where I am on the platter. I no longer have a way of going, go to track 18. So now I've actually got to read the content back from the head all the time that says where my head is going. So what we have now is we start dealing with what has to deal with speed. Speed now becomes a factor in how fast you can read things, where you're going to move your head, and what you can actually talk to, because stepping motors were very, very slow. So we have the ability to increase our speed. So the outer edge of the platter is the fastest part of the drive. Basically right now we now have more sectors on the outer edge of the platter. And when you create a partition, the very first partition, is technically created on the outside edge of the platter. So since that's the fastest location, anything that sits in that partition out close to that outside edge is going to be the fastest location on your drive. Okay, so everybody got this? Now, partitions are created on cylinder boundaries. Now, everybody kind of knows what cylinders are from that standpoint, but basically it says as you cut through the drive, that's a cylinder. Basically, I have heads that move all together at one time. So when you write at the top, then you turn on the next head, you write underneath that platter, and so on, all the way down through all the platters. That technically is the cylinder. So you're storing data amongst all of the platters instead of you don't just write to the top and fill up the top. That's not how it works. There is something called zone mapping. We'll kind of get into that in a minute. But you're writing your content down through all the drives. So we have a cylinder boundary, and that's where partitions are created. This is all legacy stuff. When we moved to LBA blocks, if anybody understands what an LBA block is, when we went from CHS to LBAs, we could have gotten rid of all this old stuff. But then you start up Norton Disk Edit or something like that, and it would have just corrupted your drive because it understood the old-fashioned. So we're bringing this legacy stuff forward for 25, 30 years now. So the point I'm trying to make is that if your cylinders are always created on cylinder boundaries, that means you always know where the beginning of your partition structure is. Everywhere you go, you can look at the beginning of the cylinder boundary and say, are you a partition? Yes. Move on, and so on and so on. It makes it a lot faster than going through the entire drive. So that means if the first partition's on the outside edge, then your second partition has to be further on into the disk, right? So let's say you got this fancy MacBook and you decide you want to install Windows on it. What it's going to do is it's going to say, okay, fine, I want 32 gigs for my Windows partition. It's going to go to the end of the disk, which is inside. It's going from 0 to the maximum LBA number that it has, and it's going to take 32 gigs and move back and end the partition there and create a new partition on the next boundary. So if any of you have looked at like disk management or something, you'll see sometimes there's a small space between the end of one partition, the beginning of the next partition. There'll be like 8 megs, and you can't use it. That's why. There's a cylinder boundary that something has to begin at for the next partition, and there's a little bit of an offset from the end of the last partition, so it's just null space that can't be used by any current operating system that's out there right now. So right now what happens is you make the second partition, and it's out there in Never Never Land. It's on the slowest part of the disk. You've now made, wherever you make another partition, you've made it further and further into the disk. So now you've made it slower and slower. So like the default for Linux installations now is typically like 3 partitions. So you'll have 3 partitions. Typically the last one's the user files. So you've actually put your stuff at the slowest part of the disk, just like what's happening to Windows on a Mac. And I'm not sure they did that on purpose, but it sure does sound like a good idea. Let's make Windows slow. Put it over here. So make them run Mac OS. We want it. So, but don't worry, I'm going to pick on Mac OS here in a few minutes. It's not like Mac fanboy here or something. So, so anyway, so this is just basically the part that I wrote to kind of back that up. There is some papers on some stuff about partitions and cylinder boundaries and how things work, and I've got a link down here that I'll give to somebody later because there is some testing utilities. There are some Linux testing utilities to actually prove this amount of space. So this is because drives write at a constant angular velocity. You now have content, you have more sectors on the outside edge of the platter than you have on the inside edge. So what happened is the designers, the manufacturers of your hard drive decided, okay, now we've got some sectors, and maybe they're faster on this part of the drive, and maybe there's some that are slower on this part of the drive. So let's divide something up into what's called a zone table. And the zone table actually says, anytime I need something that's going to be faster, I'm going to look at these tracks first and put this content out here on these tracks. So the manufacturer's making a choice of what those lower numbers are going to be for your LBA numbers. So when you say I want LBA 0, it's already picked the fastest location on the drive. And as you count up from LBA 0, it's going to get slower and slower. So, but you might have groupings of maybe 20 tracks that go together that will be fast. Yes? I'm going to get to that right here, and you'll see it in the next slide. Basically what happens, these guys wrote a free program. It's the guys from Bonnie++. They made a program that's called zcav. So basically they're doing some testing. This is what it looks like. So you guys can run this and test out your own drive or do whatever you want. It's basically trying to show the difference between speed from the outside edge of a platter to the inside edge of the platter as you go through whatever drive you're going, because it's different by drive. And you want to basically prove that the manufacturer made the right choice. Because if you have like a RAID 6 array, you may have a different setup than what the actual manufacturer is saying for its drive itself. So you can actually test where my tracks are that are the best and fastest tracks. So if this happened to be the other way in the diagram, then I'd want Mac OS to be on the inside partition and Windows to be on the outside partition. So you can test your own drive and find out what the difference is in your speed, and that's pretty much the point. So now, this right here is actual IDE hard drives, and this is a comparison of different hard drives. This is what it looks like when it's plugged into a USB controller. So you take your hard drive and plug it into a USB controller. This red line is the USB controller compared to what you're actually getting from a velocity standpoint hooked up to an ATA controller. So kind of step 2 in the whole process now is you actually can see that you're actually going to get much better performance, and it's going to degrade, but even at its slowest spot, it's going to be faster than it's going to be on a USB controller. USB is a bottleneck. He was asking if USB is a bottleneck. The issue really with USB is that as soon as you plug in the mass storage controller itself, it starts up a driver. And that basically says to your system, I don't have a processor on the thing that I'm connected to. Use my processor, my host-based processor, to handle all the management of all the stuff that's happening on this mass storage device. So on the USB memory, or whatever, whether it's a flash drive or a hard drive or whatever, it's using your processor from your machine and your operating system to actually control what's going on. So it's actually making your machine slower in the process. So you hook up 8 or 10 of them, your machine's going to be slower while it's handling that, as opposed to what's actually happening at the ATA controller level where the ATA is actually doing the work for you. So that was kind of my whole number 8. The whole point is that partitions can affect the speed of what you're actually doing. So when people are talking about, I'm going to do some database tuning or something like that, you're actually looking at where the fastest area of your hard drive is. So you can choose what you want to place there and put that content in the fastest location on the drive. And these are the tools that you use to do it with, and they're free. So I like free stuff. That kind of goes hand in hand with this number 7. Okay, so now you've got this hard drive. And maybe it's an old hard drive that came out of another system, and you want to repurpose this hard drive. So you want it to be the fastest possible drive that you can use. So rather than just relying on it, because most of you would just, everybody just take a drive, format it, and then put your stuff on it. Is that pretty much what's going on? Anybody do anything different than that? No? No examining of your sectors or partitions or what's on it? Yeah? Yes. That's where we're going. Right. Okay, so here's where we're going. You can kill the slow or the dead sectors on your drive before you repurpose it. So this is what it is. MHDD is from HDD Guru. There are other tools that do this, but this is a great one. This is a really easy tool. It's free. It does a lot of different diagnostic stuff. You can do a lot of things like HPAs and resetting sectors and things like that you can't do any other way. But it's a terrific tool, and it's free. So I'm telling you what you can do for free. So basically, it can take and examine your hard drive and look at each sector by sector, and say how long does it take for this sector to respond. You have errors on your hard drive at all times. There are always errors. There are always sectors that have problems. If they take 600 milliseconds or less, they're considered good. 600 milliseconds. 6,000 milliseconds. So at least from that standpoint, you've got up to 6 seconds that it can actually be responding and not be counted dead. Okay? So you really want things to get as low as maybe 7 milliseconds. 7 milliseconds is the average time for a good sector to respond to your request. And up to, say, 350 milliseconds is actually going to be a good response. So anything over those start to become slow sectors, takes more time for your drive to actually respond and read it. Okay? So as you're going through it, you'll get something like this. It's changed. They've changed the name of it right now. But this is the tool. You boot it. It's a little scary because you basically get a command prompt down here, and then you type scan. And it'll actually examine your drive, and it'll come up with a choice of things to do. If you have bad sectors on your disk, but you have data on your disk and you want to keep the data, do not run this. Not this way. Okay? If you have data on your disk and there's something wrong with it and you don't feel like, spin right is the right answer, or spending money, or there's a lot of other reasons not to use spin right, but we'll talk about that later. Maybe in private or something. Anyway, you have a choice here, which is remap. Now, remap basically says, read my sector, try many times, respond. If I get it good and I get it bad, then move my data to a good spot and actually repair my sector. That's what you want to do if you have data that you want to keep. If you don't have any data you want to keep and you're repurposing this drive, you're going to go down here to the bottom choice, which in this case says erase waits. But now it's a destructive erase for delayed sectors is what it's called. And so now you can actually specify this. And you can go into the config for the drive, and you can say, I only want anything that responds in less than 100 milliseconds. I want the really fast sectors. Now, from a standpoint of the size of the drive, if you're looking at a 3.5-inch hard drive, then you probably have a really fast responding drive. But if you have a 2.5-inch hard drive and it's in your laptop, you have a smaller area of space that can be fast. So if you told it get rid of everything below 100 milliseconds, the closer that it gets to the center of the disk, the more it's going to whack. So you may end up with a disk that's like half the size of what it originally was. That might not be the best choice to do without running a test first and find out how many you're going to lose. But you can tell it to destroy anything that takes too long to respond, whack those sectors, and when you're done, format, reinstall, and you've got the fastest possible hard drive that responds in seconds, milliseconds. No. You have to do this through the ATA controller. You have to boot on a disk and do it through the ATA controller. That was kind of my original setup for like the first one, is to say there's a lot of crap you can do, but you need to be on the ATA controller. So, typically what happens is you go down to the store and you buy, an Intel Atom motherboard that's, $79 with the processor, everything's already on it, and I just leave that on the desk and I keep hooking stuff up to it so that you actually have a current motherboard that actually has the newest ATA standard on it. And now any hard drives I want to work on, all I need is a monitor, pretty much, monitor and a keyboard, and I'm ready to go. So I don't have a whole lot to add to it. You cannot undo this with standard human processes. There are some special pieces of hardware and a special piece of software that can, the bad block table itself, like I said, there's 2 of them. They're stored in what's called the SA area on the hard drive. With special tools, you can erase both of them. And like I said, if you guys have data on there and you sell the drive on eBay, some of us data recovery people actually do that. We release the G list and we go back and copy all your sectors you thought were not there and look at your stuff. It's a common thing. Yeah. Yeah, if you're using, he said, what about SATA drives, basically? All of the current hard drives all conform to one of those standards. So there's either SATA or ATA. They're both part of the same set of standards. The SATA team basically has added on some additional functions and additional processes, and they have a whole other team. But they all start with the same one that started with the PETA hard drives, go to the SATA hard drives. And then all the ones that are like the smaller 1.8-inch hard drives now that have a ZIF socket on them. The ZIF socket is just a different type of connector. It's really a PETA hard drive. So you really are just trading a connector. You're trading a wire. But they're all the same. They'll all function the same, including solid state, although we can't get some content back from solid state because of the way that solid state protects the SA area and the other content. There really isn't one. So solid state is treated completely differently. And I gave a whole speech about that at ShmooCon. And I believe that's all out there. So you guys can go see the video or do whatever. It's somewhere. And it's an animated one, so it's all in depth of solid state disks. Or I'm happy to talk about it later here. This is what it looks like when MHDD is looking at the sectors themselves and it's reading the stuff. You can tell it do multiple passes, and you can see it's doing timing over here. So it'll actually tell you the timing, and it'll go through the process of identifying the different sectors and the different locations. You'll start to see a pattern that actually goes with that, but it will whack those sectors. You'll actually end up with a much faster hard drive. So I typically do this whenever I'm repurposing like a test machine for some reason, and wiping it and getting rid of the stuff. So that was my number 5. It's not. The guy who writes MHDD is making a new hardware tool. It's called the Atolla. And the Atolla you can actually hook up to a drive, and it'll actually test like the PC board itself and actually see if it's responding correctly and do images and a whole bunch of other stuff. So he may be making some changes because he's trying to go down a more commercial market. And so, but I'm sure that you can get. If you also download the, there's a Ultimate Boot CD, which is free. The Ultimate Boot CD already has it on there. What's that? Well, Hirons doesn't. There's 2 ways of getting this boot CD, and Hirons is basically the people who are the pirated ones, who are not respecting copyrights, and the free one, which is actually always respecting copyrights, is the Ultimate Boot CD. So, are you pirating your software? No. Anyway, I don't care. But nonetheless, the point is that those are the 2 ways. Hirons actually has tools on it that are copyrighted, but they're already made for you, ready to do some analysis or something. So feel free to use that one. But well, the default that they set it to is 350 milliseconds and below is normal. I like to use 150 milliseconds. That's just my standard for whacking whatever sectors I don't like. Normally, you'll get a response in about 110 milliseconds from almost all good sectors, but it's supposed to be as low as 6 and 7 milliseconds when you're actually running it against the drive, and you'll actually see that when you're doing some real diagnostics on the drive. So I feel pretty comfortable with that. Now, you have to edit their config file to make that happen. It just uses 350 by default. So, okay. All right, so now I'm going to try to make fun of some stuff here a little bit because basically, whenever you're doing any kind of operating system stuff, typically you're looking at journaling. Journaling is very important to us at this point because if your system crashes, you want to be able to back some stuff out, right? That's pretty much the point. So whatever changes it was making last, you only want to affect, like if you're looking at a Windows system and you have NTFS and you have an MFT, which is basically the catalog that keeps track of all your files, if something bad was to happen while you were writing a file, you just want it to back that out and then you can complete and move on, right? That's the story. So you only want to make changes that are necessary. You don't want to be making changes to the catalog system that is actually used by your operating system unnecessarily. That would be stupid, right? But in HFS, on the current Macs that currently exist, HFS Plus, they store the X and Y coordinates for a window in the Finder. No, I'm not kidding. The X and Y coordinates are stored in the catalog. They only have one catalog, and with the files and the pointers to the file, basically like an inode, they store the X and Y coordinates for where the window is on your screen. So as you move it and you drag it along, it's updating the location in the catalog file. So it could theoretically crash, and it has. It can't. I can actually make it happen. Crash, and actually at the point it's writing the X and Y coordinates and corrupt the catalog. Because the catalog in a Mac OS, anybody know anything about HFS? Anybody really in depth? It's daisy chained together. This is another bad decision. All the content, it's a B tree, and in the B tree, every time that it splits, it daisy chains together the next set of files. And so if you have corruption and something happens somewhere in the middle of the tree, you lose everything else that's in the rest of the tree. It just knobs it off. It says bye-bye.
That's also the way access databases are set up, which is why if you get corrupted, you can crash the content.
Right. He says access databases are set up the same way, that they're a tree and they're daisy chained together, and so you can't find the rest of your content. But this is an operating system that we're talking about here, and that's actually what happens. So anyway, the X and Y coordinates are physically written in the pointer system. So it looks like this. I'm using a Java utility to actually look at this code here. So you actually look, there is Finder information in there. And it even tracks the scroll position. So you actually have where the scroll bar is. No kidding. That's really the way it is. So this is for every file. It's not just for the files that you would actually, applications or something. This is an RTF, okay? This is a freaking text file, okay? I'm pulling it up. I'm looking at a text file. It's actually storing and making updates to the Finder's info where it physically is, where its Windows location arm, where I don't know. I just thought that was a really bad idea. So hopefully ZFS will fix some of these. Yes?
Can you hypothecate what the rationale for that design was?
Don't question Steve.
Okay. I'll tell you. Luckily enough, that's going to help me move into my next one, my number 5. What was the rationale behind it? Well, okay, so let's kind of do this a little bit as a fight again between, all right, let's talk about Linux versus, EXT versus HFS, okay? Now, I have a lot of admiration for the people who designed EXT3. I thought it was an awesome design. Basically, the whole point is we have EXT2, and it previously existed, and we want to stay compatible with it, but we want to add on journaling. So if you only have a system that supports EXT2, you can actually turn off journaling, get the same files, and it actually keeps track of everything for when the update needs to actually happen when it goes back to an EXT3 system. So basically, it's doing the ability to use all your current tools. You can use all your current EXT2 tools to do any kind of repair of an EXT3 system. So I thought that was awesome that they actually built that in and had enough forethought in EXT3 to think about, okay, fine, we might need to go back and have reasons to use EXT2. So that's a pretty awesome design. So HFS, well, that's a different story. HFS has been around for 1984, basically, is what we're looking at. The original HFS was basically released with Macs and Mac Classics and stuff. They didn't do an update to it until pretty much 1999, 2001, in that range there. So there was no real fundamental changes. And when you start having portables, you start having problems. You start needing journaling, and you're not connected to power supplies or something like that. So anyway, the point is, when they did HFS and they decided, well, let's add journaling, what about all those people who have Mac Classics and that they can't use journaling because they don't have the upgraded system. Well, when they mount our drive, let's do this. Let's just have one window in the middle of the screen that says, where have all my files gone? That's what happened. Seriously, I'm not kidding. This is in 2001. This was the window you got. If you were on an old Mac and somebody had a new Mac and they had HFS Plus on it and they put their file system on it and they plug it into the Mac, this was what you got. Now, I don't know what was inside this. I mean, this is how you have a heart attack, right? You open it up and you go, oh, crap, where the hell's all my stuff? So, and can you imagine what the repercussions of this would be today? If, okay, we got a new system and let's just, when they move to ZFS, that if we don't support HFS2 and keep it in the operating system, then let's just tell them where their files are in a text file. We're saved. So, and I'm pretty sure, I'm not positive, but I'm guessing that when you open the text file and you read it, it probably says, upgrade your Mac. That's probably what it said. Go buy a new one. See you at the store. So that was the best I could think of. So, but this was not that long ago. 2001? Okay. So, but I hypothesize that part of the issue is that it was a real early design. And in the philosophy of the design was, well, let's just store everything with the, everything in the catalog, everything that actually happens. And this is another problem that actually happens with HFS all the time. So in, every other operating system, FAT has two copies. There's a mirror copy. When you're dealing with NTFS, there's an NTFS mirror, so they're MFT mirror. So all that content's mirrored. You're dealing with ext3 or ext systems. You have superblocks, and they're clustered across the drive, and so there's multiple locations where they all exist. But in HFS, there's one catalog, one single solitary item. And if something happens to that catalog and it dies, there is nowhere you can go. So you guys who are running like Disk Wizard or whatever the hell it is, the Disk Repair, Disk Warrior, if you go and use Disk Warrior and you're doing it on your original hard drive and it's crawling through your catalog and it says, oh crap, here's an error, let's fix it. In a lot of cases, you lose what came after that. So you've already made an irreversible process happen here. You need to make a copy of your drive, an image of your drive, before you run something that's going to do a catalog repair. Because your files are probably still there, but you'll never be able to access them again. You'll whack it.
I'm almost positive there's a second copy on HFS, and you can also mount HFS with journaling turned off. It's not trivial that I've done it.
Okay. He says you can mount HFS with the journaling turned off, and he thinks there's a second copy. I'll have to go and look at the structure again, but what? Right. Yeah, I mean, if you know, because I've looked for it, I can't find it, but I've been doing it with a hex editor, so. Okay. All right. But, and how hard was it to turn off journaling and still be able to see your files?
It turns out there's like a hidden header somewhere you can turn off.
Okay.
Trivial, but finding it is not.
All right. Well, let's talk afterwards then. Okay. All right. So you learn something new every day. Okay, so my next one is MACE times. Basically, you guys all know what MAC times are, modified access created. That's pretty much in everything. There actually is an additional one in NTFS. So in NTFS, there is a MFT entry modified piece of content. Basically what happens is you have a file, it sits on the drive. The file, when it exceeds the size that it can keep track of in the current cluster, when the size, like for instance, you open a Word document and you paste in a picture, and now the picture makes the file bigger, that it will expand into another cluster. And when it does, there is a timestamp that's actually written back in the MFT. And it says when that actually occurred. So you can actually read an additional timestamp. So this is important when you're dealing with like forensics cases or something like that, where you have a file that might have changed in size that wasn't supposed to change in size. So you have a court order that says don't delete anything, and the guy goes in and opens up a Word document and hits Control A and deletes everything, and it's gone. And the size physically changed and got smaller. You'll have a timestamp that's actually written in there, and it might be in violation of a court order or something like that. So there actually is content that's there. Now, up until FTK 2.0 came out, Incase was the only one that could read that. There was some people who found out about this, and actually, because I don't know that all this is well documented, but there's a utility that's called timestomp, and timestomp will actually stomp all over the MFT entries and get rid of this and basically return like null results in Incase. FTK will read crap, basically, but FTK 2.0, there's nobody using that. That's crap, too. But That's a different discussion. And there is a Perl script, and this is only a small fragment of the Perl script. It's not the whole thing, but here's the link to it down here. But there's a Perl script for people who do an analysis on MFTs and want to read that content using Linux or something else. You can actually read that MFT, and there's so few things that actually read that content and tell you that time, and it may be very important. So I thought I'd throw it up there and at least let you know that it's there so you can go look it up and figure out what there is. But at least from that standpoint, I was impressed that there was this time that I could actually try to figure out when a change occurred. There's only one, so it doesn't keep track of it like in multiple stages, but at least from that standpoint, it would be valuable to you. Okay, so this one's just kind of like I thought was awesome because so many few people do not give this a lot of thought. This is the landing zone of your hard drive. So basically, when you start thinking about your landing zone, now everybody remembers, or at least maybe some of you that are old enough, like you have an MFM hard drive and you had to go park your head. You guys remember that? Right? Yeah. So because basically what happened is there was a slider that is on the head assembly itself, and it's basically protecting the read heads and the induction coil. And the slider basically looks kind of like a U shape, and it's touches the platter. It'll actually sit there, or did sit there back in the day. So when the drive was running, the head would float over the platter. When it stopped running, it would just land, and then you had to say, I want to park this thing so that I can get it out of the way so I can move my hard drive. So there was a lot of thought that was given to how I want to park this thing in later drives when we actually switched to a spot where they were going to park and stay in one place. You guys remember stiction? Everybody remember stiction? Okay, so your head would land on the platter. And believe it or not, it's a real word. Your head would land on the platter, and the lubrication and the physical force of the fact that the slider is so smooth and the platter is so smooth, they basically are like forces, and they attract each other and sticks to the platter. It does not come off. So the torque that was required to turn the motor to make the head float over the platter and to create the air bearing that the platter needed so that it would cause the head to float was too great that it wouldn't break free. So you guys remember that? Anybody remember? How did you fix it? Yeah, you spin it or you whack it on the side. That was really the way to fix it because you whack it on the side and then it would break free of the lubrication and this torque problem and cause the platters to spin. So when they were designing a later edition of the hard drive, they said, well, let's park these heads. Let's do something. And there's an additional one besides parking in the center, which is basically designed by IBM, but at least at that point in time, they were thinking, okay, let's park in the center. So basically that was kind of one of the problems is that you had this like force that's going to get stuck to the platter. And any time that you have two very smooth surfaces and you try to make them smoother, because it has to be so unique so that the head can actually fly over the platter without whacking something, that they have to be so smooth they are like forces and stick together. So that's kind of the whole point of this thing being the smooth operator. The issue is that when you go to park it and it's touching the heads, now in smaller hard drives in 3.5s and 2.5s, there's not enough torque to break free of that tension. So they had to say, well, okay, fine, where are we going to park this head? And they decided on the center of the head, and the center of the platters. The reason they decided on the center of the platters is that the motor that's right here on the spindle creates EMI interference, and it actually causes a problem writing content to this inner ring. You cannot write content in that inner ring. It basically, as the motor spins up, creates this interference, and it'll actually flip bits. So you actually lose your content. So they basically said, okay, fine, we got this central ring. We can't use it for anything else. So they basically terraform this content right here. I don't know how clear it is on this slide right here, but basically what happens is they created a groove set of surfaces that is opposite of what is required for the tension that actually happens when the two smooth surfaces are touching. And they do fill that with lubrication, but I thought it was unique how they actually made the grooves in the opposite direction. They actually slant back towards the head. And if anybody's opened the drive and you spin the spindle, you'll see that it's very, very smooth at that spot. It'll just keep on spinning pretty much. It has a fluid motion. But as soon as you move it out of that groove towards the edge of the platter or something, it starts to almost grind. It's touching the platter, and there is no spot for it. And if you stop, in some cases, it'll just stick and it'll stay there. So that's one of the reasons why they chose the center solution, and they groove it in a fashion that the heads can actually float in a very smooth pattern over that. So that was number 3. Now, number 2, when you're dealing with solid-state drives, and as I said earlier, there's a whole other presentation on solid-state drives. One of the things that people don't seem to understand is, okay, you go and take pictures and you put your roll of film in a drawer. Sometimes 20 years later, you can still develop that film. Something still comes out. But that's not going to be true of solid-state disks. Solid-state disks basically store in a cell, there is an electron. And the electron is stored in this cell, but the cell gradually gets damaged over time, and it will release the electron from the cell. So it doesn't like dissipate and die in there because you don't have changes in mass. It just basically gets set free. So after 8 or 10 years, whatever was on that has, if that drive has not been powered at any point in time and it's just sitting in a drawer, it's going to be blank in 10 years. So that's not a good long-term storage. So if you're doing forensics or you want to put something in the safe, if you put it on a solid disk drive and you put it in the safe, in 10 years, it's going to be blank. And that might be bad for your case for some of these things that are, murder cases where you got to keep it for 20 years or something. And yeah, flash cards for camera are the same way. Pretty much any of the solid-state media that's based on NAND technology. NAND is the basic chipset that's used for that design. And those electrons, as they're released over time, you're not going to have your data. You're going to have stuff that's actually changed. Now, this is a hard thing to test, too, because, you want to test it. You put it in a drawer, and you come back in 3 years, and you plug it in. Well, now you've just destroyed that part of the test. So you got to make, 20 of these things. And I think we're in a situation now where we actually have technologies that, as they're created, we don't know how long things are going to last. And so we're starting to have problems with older CDs that were written in the 90s and things that were done with, because CDRs are basically made with a dye, an organic dye, and it dies over time. So long-term storage, there really is no easy way to do long-term storage right now that I know of that's going to last, other than storing things in a cold place, dropping the temperature, doing magnetic media or something that's going to store it. There are some optical medias that do survive, or press CDs, obviously. But solid state's the big discussion these days because now we're at the beginning of it, and we only have some solid-state disks that have been around for 5 or 6 years now. But they're like 64K. Anybody still using like a 64K solid-state disk? No? Some people in the military are. They had some IDs on them, and they still use them. And then my number one thing, which kind of you already heard about earlier, was I always have this discussion all the time that drives are not hermetically sealed. If they were hermetically sealed, there would be no exchange with the air from the inside to the outside. There actually is an exchange of air. In this case, I found one that had the breather holes on the bottom underneath the platters themselves to kind of balance out what the airflow is between the top. There's a hole in the top that says, "Do not cover me." And so physically, air flows through the drive to try to keep the balance so that the air bearing in the heads will spin. Now, there probably are really some hermetically sealed drives that might be used in Air Force or something like that, where you actually have a difference in pressure, that the heads are not going to float at the same space. But for the common drives that we're actually using, you do not have a hermetically sealed drive. Now, I'm not saying that you don't need a clean room or that no one would ever need a clean room to do this, but that tended to be the big discussion everybody was saying. I even saw some posts even on HDD Guru just a couple of weeks ago where a guy says, well, I opened my hard drive on a table and just to look at it and see if it was scratched, and then I put the lid back on. And everybody on the forum said, well, then you're done. You can't do anything with your drive. Just throw it away because you opened it. Well, that's not true. That's physically not true. Now, there was a time period where we were trying to rebuild hard drives, and we were trying to actually get a drive running again because it's $1,000 or something, and keep it. Now you're basically trying to do a repair, get your content off, and throw the disk in the trash. So your problem is not dust and particles and things like that typically get on the drive. What it is primarily, because what's going to happen here is if you have dust on your platter, as soon as it spins up, it creates the air bearing. The air bearing is the air pressure that causes everything to fling off of the platters, and it's going to go out into this outside track, and there actually is a filter out there that's actually going to capture that content. And now one of the side effects from that filter is that some people don't realize is that you take a drive that's been in a machine for years and years and years. That filter's got content in it because there's always stuff coming off your drive. There might be little fragments or things that are actually coming off, and they're in that little tray. And when you take that drive and you hold it on its side and you walk over to another machine and plug it in, the content's coming out of that tray, and now it's floating around inside the drive. And it's a lot more than just I've got one little speck or something like that. It can actually be something that jams between the head and keeps the head from reading and causes a scratch in the platter. So you need to be really careful about that if you're just grabbing a drive and doing something with it. But my point is that as soon as the platter starts to spin up, the content that's on the platter is going to fling off, and it's going to go into this track, and it will be fairly safe. What it's not safe from is oils from your skin, fragments of skin that flake off of you while you're working on it. And believe it or not, in a classroom where we're actually working on stuff, this stuff starts to show up. You'll actually see it physically on the platter, that while you're working on it, flakes of skin come off of your hand and will be on the platters. So typically you work away from you. You have a fan or something that actually is blowing at you, and it will actually blow the content back towards you as you're working on it. Try to wear gloves. Try to do it in a sanitary environment. But you can work on it and successfully rebuild them. I think Skydog probably rebuilt 4 drives in my class. And out of 10 people that were in the most recent class I had, all but one person rebuilt at least 3 to 4 drives out of 5 drives and got them working again after completely disassembling and reassembling them in a classroom. So there's Skydog with his... Yeah, he's wearing a SmoothCon shirt, and he had these little fancy gloves on. You don't know how hard it is for me to make people put these gloves on in the class. You know, so look, I mean, like this guy, he doesn't have it. A bunch of them don't have it, and they're working on the drives. These guys still got them working, but, you know, this was the cleaner, better, more efficient way to do it. With a $2 pair of gloves, you can work on a drive and physically do something. So, you know, there's people working. Now, you know, this is my problem in the class, is that no female yet, out of 100 people or so that I've trained, no female yet has actually put one back together and got it working yet. All the men pretty much have done that. I'm not. You might be the first. But yes. But typically, she did not get her drive working again. Her drive, when she was done with it, looked like that. So drives are now made. In the last 2 years, almost every drive is made with glass ceramic as the platter itself. Before that, they were mostly aluminum. So you could actually have a stiffer material that didn't crack or whatever. So this is a IBM Hitachi drive. And when she put the platters back in, she had them a little offset, and she screwed them. And, no, I don't mean literally, but she literally screwed the screws back in and then cracked the platter right there in the middle of the room. So that was yeah, no problem. You know, because, you know, they say they got it off the space shuttle and something like this, but, you know, eventually you could probably piece it back together, maybe. So anyway, so that's how it works. People in the class reassembling stuff. Am I out of time? How are we looking on time? Yes.
To address the long-term storage thing, I think you said something that may actually provide a solution. What if your long-term storage facility had a periodic recharge of the entire solid-state environment? Does that help with some of the...
Yes. His point is that you periodically recharge your devices. There is a whole cycle of events that actually happens with a solid-state disk as soon as it is actually powered on, because there is technically no such thing as write protecting a USB memory stick, solid-state, flash, any of those. They actually will already do functions when the drive is powered on, even if they are not connected to your system. And so there is no technical thing as far as a write blocker goes. So there are some issues that will come up, so you can't like keep it permanently powered because it will actually cause physical damage to the disk over time. So you could periodically go back every once a year, as long as you made sure you were on a schedule, and power them up, make sure everything's fine, put it away. And so, but that's pretty hard for like police departments and FBI and things like that. I mean, they're constantly using materials that have been on older types of drives for years. So you're always having to think about what the next step is. Like most of you probably have upgraded tape drives before, right? What happens to the old tapes and the tape drive? You might keep the old tapes in a closet thinking you're going to go back to them, but then no one saves the tape drive. The tape drive like goes out the window, and you never can get back to your 7 years of bad tapes that you needed, you know, for your FBI investigation or something like that. It happens. So long-term storage is going to be a problem anyway. Yes.
Some years ago, there were reports that magnetic media had problems with the alignment of the atoms shifting over time. So
Yes, that's true.
gradual fading of the magnetic field.
His point is that magnetic drives over time do have a problem with the magnetic shift of the atoms and the way the atoms are actually stored. There is a professor who basically works for IBM. He's the original guy who did the design on what we now have called the GMR head. The GMR head has basically been every drive since a 20 gig hard drive basically has this GMR head in it. So his name's Stuart Parkins. He's been working at IBM at Palo Alto for years on a new technology that he calls, it was originally called memory domains. Now it's called racetrack memory by some marketing people or whatever. He's got a prototype already working. He states that he has a solid piece of metal, basically, that he can store your content in, and it does not change the state of an atom, that it actually stores the content in some sort of a pulse mechanism. I read this white paper like over and over and over again. I still do not completely understand it, but I believe in this guy because he's got a really good track record from a standpoint of most of the technology we use, we owe to him. So if you want to read something about that, that would probably be the best way to go. He thinks that he actually made statements. He doesn't trust his own drives, the hard drives that he made. So he's working on this new technology to actually do long-term storage. He says by 2015, we are all going to get rid of flash devices and hard drive and be using racetrack memory for his storage. So, what's my what? I have a bunch, but I don't have time. I'm out of time. If you guys want to see it, we can go someplace or something, but I'm out of time. Next guy needs to get up. Ninth floor. I got like 20 more slides. Anything else? That's it? Yeah.
Have you had any positive experiences with using the remap feature in MHDD?
Yes. Yeah, it does work.
When the drive has mechanically gone bad?
Well, there's some issues with mechanics, period. I actually do rebuilds of the physical drive itself, so I actually move the platters to an actual good drive. So I actually physically will move the heads and everything, and that's actually part of the additional information. I have a movie and the whole thing where I show it happen. But I can actually move the physical heads themselves to another hard drive and rebuild the drive and do a data recovery on it. So I'm not usually trying to remap them at that point. I'm actually trying to get the content off, which I have a different method for doing. So I'm not trying to put that drive back in play. So I fix physical ones a different way. Okay? Does that help?
By fixing it for real.
Fix it long enough to get the crap off of it. Yeah, right. All your porn. I get all your porn back. So I get paid for a lot of porn, actually. That's the way it goes. So I need all my pictures. Yeah, that's okay. So, all right. Who's next?